Hello. I'd like to present a series of a couple slides. First one I'm going to start with is referred to as accessing collections. One, you assess a collection and there's multi-steps to it. And the next set of slides I will do after this one is specifically about weeding. So let's get started. I'll talk a little bit about assessing collections. That leads into essentially weeding. You have to be able to assess the collection from beginning to end to see how it works. Now, why do you assess a collection? The primary reason, and the book has a few, is to meet the needs of today's user. In other words, you're not concerned about yesterday's user, obviously. You want to know how the collection meets the needs of the user that the library has established for today. You're going to do a collection development needs a study. That's all part of this. And as you're developing and learning about the user of the library, one of the next assignments I have actually is how to develop a collection development policy. And to be able to do a collection development policy that meets the needs of the user, you have to assess the collection. Does the collection that you have today meet the needs? Do you need to add things or withdraw things? And we're going to talk about those. But the question here is, how does it meet today's user? What in assessing a collection, and I'm sure there are other topics in the book, but one is it helps write the collection development policy that you're going to be writing in the class. It learns the scope of the collection and any changes that you might need about the collection itself. In other words, you're not looking at any specific book, you're looking at the whole set. Everything from let's say all the children's print books, for an example, or any given area in between. What is the ratio the library has to print electronic? Many state assessment programs are going to ask you how much of your collection is print, how much of your collection is electronic. It's going to it'll do the ratio for you, but it'll say how many copies do you have in print, how many copies do you have in electronic. It looks at the strengths and weaknesses of the collection. You're going to look at an area of collection. You're going to say, what is the library strong about? What is the library weak about? Some of these things I think will be answered more specifically as we talk about weeding, because one of the things you have to do in weeding is you have to look at the strengths and weaknesses of the collection. In other words, you look at a whole collection. How do you know if it's strong or weak? We're going to talk about those things a little bit. Other issue is collections to programs. How does the collection fit the programs that the library chooses to do in a public library or an academic library? You may have specific programs, but does the collection support the program? If you're a public library, let's say, and you're doing a story hour, do you have the books to support the story hours that you intend to do? Sometimes they tend to be thematic. If you're an academic library, you might do a program on a particular study, a field. You may be asked by a teacher or a professor or somebody to do a program. Do you have the collection that supports that area that they want? And that answers the questions. As you look at these things, how well are the selectors functioning? You look at an area and you see how the selector has been putting that area together. When we say changes, it's more of a case of changes to the selector may be doing the research, and the changes that the selector has. It may be a head of collections looking at the whole area and saying, I need to help the selector in this fashion. It gives you weeding data. What areas do you need to weed that you know about? And importantly, it gives you an inventory of the collection in case of loss. In other words, say an entire collection caught on fire. How much is that collection worth? If you had to file for say the library burned to the ground, and they say, how much is it worth? Well, how do you answer that unless you've assessed the collection and have an inventory? The other questions that come out of the assessment is the budget appropriate for that particular collection area? Does it need to be boosted in any way? Perhaps you determine that the area has not got enough materials in it and you need to add more materials, and you may need a budget, maybe not for multiple years, but at least maybe say for 1 year you might need an extra money to build a collection. So it helps determine the collection for the budget. It helps determine the budget for the collection as overall, but also says in this one field of study, you may need more money. You may need money for 1 to 2 years, let's say, but so that you can boost it suddenly, and then you don't need as much later on to keep it going. It also tells you areas that need to be improved or not. Areas that you may have to borrow via interlibrary loan processes, whatever the state that you're in does for electronic, for interlibrary loan. What areas at that library do you need to improve, or you realize that it doesn't need improving to match the needs of the user, but you may have to borrow more materials. And then, of course, for a variety of universities, schools, public libraries, in colleges and schools, it can be very useful for accreditation, especially in colleges. Sometimes, like say the business college is being accredited, they need to know what is being spent in business at the college to support the business college. It is quite common that a library, a university library, college library, university library, will get an accreditation. Law does this, for example. How much money goes to the library to support that collection area? How many items do they have? Do they have, X thousands of items in this field of study? Based on whoever's doing the accreditation. The other thing can be used is you might find areas that are weak that you can go apply to grants to get. You might, if a donor gives money, you might say, we could really boost this one area, and you determine a donor for this area. And consortia can often ask or need to know what areas the library is strong in. In some states, consortia have borrowing privileges among libraries in a consortia, or it could be a cooperative, or it could be just something that they need for their records. Now, the methods that one uses to determine or to assess the collection can be a variety of things. One is core lists. Are very standard. In other words, you have a field of study, and there's a list that has been printed that says these are the items that this area must have. Frequently, it's in universities you'll find core lists. You'll find core lists for public libraries. There's a variety of different core lists based on the level of the collection. The trick would be to find what core list is appropriate for what collection area you're doing. But there are frequently lists they're printed or online that say these are the things that you need to have in order to have a competent collection in this area. There are standard lists, lists that are not particularly core lists, but maybe lists in journal articles, different things that say these are the standard things that you should have in a collection. There are bibliographies. You might find a reference where in the back of the reference it says these are the things that this book recommends, this book has in its bibliography, so your library should have these things too. Depends on what the book is, of course, but the bibliographies and such in those things can be used as well. Another one is comparison to similar libraries. How does this library compare to another library that has the same field of study. Expert opinion. Finding someone who is a superb area, knows an area fairly well and knows what type of materials you'd have to have. And then, of course, there's user studies. As you talk to people, you determine what, or you can send out a survey, different things that you can ask the user, what sort of things do you expect the library to have? You can use interlibrary loan statistics. What things are actually borrowed from the library? Maybe those are areas that you're weak in because they're being borrowed so much. A lot of times, a lot of libraries will share the interlibrary loan statistics with the selectors so they can see, is a particular area being asked for a lot that you would need to add to the collection. I'm going to jump. I'll say missing copies. If a copy is stolen or something, maybe there's a reason for it. Maybe it's missing because it is of an area that needs to be built up. It can tell you a variety of things, but missing copies are useful. Now, the other one I wanted to mention, this is just above this, is citation studies, or the impact factor. Today, it's the Web of Science. In the past, it used to be science citation, social science citation, arts and humanities citation. Now, what citation studies do is they tell you about journal publication, magazines, journals, really. What it does is it looks, and the way the Web of Science operates is it does roughly 20% of the publications that have 80% of the articles, the old 80-20 rule. And the impact factor is a calculation. It's an actual formula. I'm not going to even bring up the formula because it's so complex. But what it does is it gives a number for the number of times that publication is cited and used. In other words, you take a particular publication, and how many times in that publication is that publication cited by other authors. You take a variety of things, and you end up with an impact factor. And the level of the impact factor, which is a number, like 10 or 9.995 kind of thing. But the number tells you how important it is to the journal. In other words, a journal with a different impact factor, higher or lower, has to do with how popular the publication is. If I remember correctly, and I'll double check this, we can talk about this a little more, but I believe a higher impact factor is a more important publication. But there is a limit. It's basically it's kind of a percentage, but it's actually calculated more specifically to see how many times a publication has been cited by another author. To give an idea, and how many times our articles are written in it, to give an idea of how important that journal is to a particular field. It is not something where you would look at like an overall, like in a public library magazines. Impact factor is used mostly by universities, and it is used in a very specific field. In other words, you might do English as a rule, or you might do a subset of English, or you might do a subset of a science, or you might do all the particular publications in a particular field of science or a particular field of sociology. And by using the impact factor, you get what publications should you actually have on the shelf. Of course, impact factor nowadays is more related to electronic publications, but it is still, what publications do you need to have versus the ones that are lesser importance? Used very heavily in the day of the print publication, which one's sorted, which one's not. Now with electronic, usually usually done by a selection. You're not ordering a specific journal in a field. You're ordering a collection in the field, but you might still have some degree of control over what you buy or don't buy from that publisher or that company, and the impact factor can come into a place there. Now, the other thing you have to consider is you use the accessing of the collection as information for weeding, which we'll cover a little bit more. Academic libraries may store materials not frequently used but important to have. Some libraries will not actually have materials on the shelf, but rather they move them to a storage area. Some libraries have used bin storage, where when a person requests an item, it's actually physically brought up to them. Usually that's the way it operates. It's either in bin storage or it's in physical remote storage that they can get within a fairly short period of time, but it's not instantaneously browsable on the shelf. It's something that a person would go onto the computer and say, I want this item, and then the library would bring it in from wherever they store the materials. That tends to be academic libraries, of course, because academic libraries tend to not weed as heavily, depending on the field. Some institutions I worked at prevented weeding, and they had to do quite a bit of storage. Other libraries will allow you to weed different editions or similar, like the same edition of a book, but not necessarily. Some of them will not allow you to weed entirely completely. A lot of them are trying to maintain large numbers for various things like accreditation or to comparison, by having a larger collection. So academic libraries do weed, but not weed as heavily, say, as public libraries. Now, again, when we talked about this in brief, there's the virtual office page or email or discussions that you can send to me. Now, we'll have another session on weeding, which will probably give you a little, I'll provide some links to some materials that'll give you a little bit more information. That works very well in assessing collections as well. Thank you very much, and I'll see you at the next lecture. Thank you.